Okay, so I wanted to do a full story video, right? I want to do a full story video over Warren Ellis' run on Excalibur. Now, not his complete run, but more kind of like the early days of his run. Here's the thing. When it comes to Warren Ellis, as we all know by this point, because it's been like, what, 2-3 years? Since he had gone through some legal issues, the man has a lot of issues going on at the moment. And this is not me choosing a side. The reason why I'm doing this full story video is because I want you guys to kind of see the early days of his run on Excalibur and how great he was on that title, but also kind of like what he was trying to achieve on that title as well. And the thing was, for Warren Ellis, when he begun to work on Excalibur, they had to tell him to stop because Age of Apocalypse popped off in the middle of the early days of his run. But also you can kind of see that for Warren Ellis, he was trying to do something new with Kitty Pryde, kind of help move that character along. And so I kind of want to show you guys the early days of his run. But again, this is not me choosing a side, because that man has some things going on right now and in the past as well, and that's on the side right here. We're only focusing on his work, and that's really it. So either way, here is Excalibur full story video of the early days of Warren Ellis' run. Okay, so we have to continue our coverage over the X-Men, right? Which means covering different books like X-Factor, X-Force, Wolverine, Cable, and so on and so on. But that also means covering Excalibur. Now, when it comes to Excalibur, by this point, we are getting into the run of Warren Ellis. Now, here's the thing, because a few years ago, Warren Ellis got into some legal issues. And honestly, I'm not going to sit here and give the details about what he actually did in the past. No. What I'm trying to say is that even though I am covering these storylines, we have to. And the reason why, because Warren Ellis did play a major role when it came to Excalibur. And Excalibur plays a huge role in the world of X-Men comics. And so, unfortunately, we have to cover his run. So just in case there's folks out there who do get upset with the idea of me covering Warren Ellis' run on Excalibur, just know that I'm doing this because it's part of our coverage over the X-Men. It's not me picking a side at all here. So with that being said, let's go ahead and dive into the first story arc that Warren Ellis gave us when it came to Excalibur. Now, before we can properly dive into this story arc, there are a few things you need to know when it comes to this story arc. It's called the Soul Sword Trilogy. Now, the Soul Sword Trilogy is really important because of one particular character, and that would be Illyana. Now, when it comes to Illyana, we know her as Magic, but also the younger sister to Colossus. Now, by this point in Marvel's timeline, Illyana is officially dead. Like, she died from the legacy virus. But let me explain why the Soul Sword is so important when it comes to Illyana, but now becoming important for Kitty Pryde as well. So now we have to wind the clock back to the point where we were introduced to a little girl known as Illyana, the younger sister to Colossus, who was just a small girl, and that was it. But then over time, you had Illyana stay with the X-Men. Now, they were at a base of Magneto, but while being there, Illyana had fallen through some kind of portal. Now, to the X-Men, she was only gone for 12 seconds, but in reality, she was gone for years in a different dimension, better known as Limbo. Now, while being in Limbo, she had met a character known as Belasco. When it came to Belasco, he had technically, raised Magic, but also tried to use her for his own personal gain. Now, once he was somewhat done with her, but also she was able to escape and defeat him, when she came back over to Earth, years had passed by for her in Limbo. She was no longer a small child. She was now a teenager. And so over the years, you had Illyana be part of the New Mutants, along with the rest of those characters like Cannonball, Wolfbane, and the list goes on. Now, when it came to X-Men Inferno, when it came to Illyana, she turned back into a child at the end of that event right there. But now we have to talk about the Soul Sword. And the Soul Sword is really important because it was Ileana who had created the Soul Sword using her life force energy. Now, after doing that, she became the ruler of Limbo. It was said that if you possess the Soul Sword, you become the ruler of Limbo. So, of course, you had different people try their best to actually get their hands on the Soul Sword. With all being said, when it came to Ileana, when she was turned back into a child and died, the Soul Sword kind of went over to Kitty Pryde. So technically right now, Kitty Pryde is the actual owner of the Soul Sword. Now, that's everything you need to know for right now before we dive into the storyline. Because again, there's a lot going on before we can dive into this three-part story arc. And so, getting into the opening pages for today's storyline, we do pick up with Bishop. Now, this is Bishop using the Blackbird as a way to deliver some packages over to Muir on Muir Island, and also Excalibur as well. Because remember, by this point in Marvel's timeline, when it came to Excalibur, their current base was Muir Island, using Muir lab as their base. Now, with that being said, we do shift our focus over to Kitty Pryde. And the reason why, because you have Kitty Pryde kind of having a outsider day. And what I mean by that statement is that you have Kitty Pryde try to look at the different members of Excalibur as a ordinary person, because for her, she had 14 years of a normal life before she had joined the X-Men. After that, her life was no longer normal at all. But either way, for Kitty Pryde, what she is saying right now is that when she looks at the different members of Excalibur as a ordinary person, well, yeah, they look like creatures and monsters. But you did have Nightcrawler appear, and he does kind of add into what she is thinking, like, yes, we may look like creatures and monsters to an ordinary person, but look at Megan, look at Captain Britain. Like, those two characters are madly in love with one another. And it's Nightcrawler saying, like, with us being members of Excalibur or the X-Men or whatever X team, we have a crazy life. But then with that crazy life, we now value a normal life even more. Now, after that, you did have Nightcrawler take Kitty Pryde over to Bishop so that she'll be able to get her mail, her packages that came from Jubilee, some brand new clothes. But now we have to jump over to Egypt. When we do, we pick up with a character known as Amanda Selfton. Now, Amanda is part of Excalibur, but also she is the girlfriend to Nightcrawler. You see, around this time in Marvel Comics, Nightcrawler and her begin to date one another once again. Now, earlier, we had talked about the idea that for Amanda, she was a foster sister to Nightcrawler. Her mother, Margali, had raised her and Nightcrawler together, but over the years, they were able to build a relationship with one another. But either way, for Amanda, she is a powerful sorceress, but not as powerful as her mother. And really, speaking of her mother, we do pick up with her right now in the alleyway, and that'll be Margali. Now, we have talked about Margali before, but just only briefly, and I feel like this time we kind of dive in a tad bit more about her character, but also the magic she's currently using as well. Now, by this point in our coverage over the X-Men, we don't know everything about her. Just know that when it comes to Margali, she does use a power source of magic called the Winding Way. Now, I said in my last video when it came to her character that the Winding Way can be somewhat confusing in the world of Marvel Comics. And the reason why, because it could mean a lot of different things. Like, for example, a dimension or possibly a source of immense mythic powers, but also a living entity. Like, over the years, the whole idea of the Winding Way or the Winding Road has been used in different types of ways in Marvel Comics. Now, with all that being said, when it comes to Margali, it kind of gives the idea that the Winding Way is more like this road that gives you magical abilities. And as you take the road, you become more powerful over time. Now, with each point of power you gain, you also have to go through a point in your life where you're at an all-time low. Kind of make you more humble about the idea of the power that you are receiving. Now, the reason why Morgali is here is to warn Amanda about a different sorcerer who's right now on the winding way as well. And that will be a character known as Grave Moss. Now, when it comes to Grave Moss, what he wants to do is to use the Soul Sword as a way to kill off any other magician who's ahead of him at the moment on the winding way, so that he'll then be able to gain more power at a faster rate. And so it's Morgali telling Amanda, you have to find a Soul Sword and keep it away from him, because if he does get his hands on the Soul Sword, then most likely he'll kill off people who are ahead of him on the winding way, so that he'll then be able to gain a huge amount of power at a faster rate than normal. But now we have to jump over to Muir Island. Now, when we do, we pick up with, well, Megan going crazy once again. I kind of realized that in Excalibur, when it comes to Megan, she has a lot of these moments where she begins to freak out of nowhere. Now, we have to remember that for Megan, she is connected to the nature around her, the world around her. So right now, there is a good reason why she's freaking out. The thing is, we have no idea why just yet. But you do have Muir McTaggart and also Brian being able to knock her out. Now, their goal is to take her down to the laboratory to kind of figure out what's going on with her this time. The problem is that while you have Brian and also Muir McTaggart trying to move Megan, you have Kitty Pryde just walk through the room, ignoring them completely. And so for Muir McTaggart, she's kind of wondering what in the world is going on with Kitty Pryde. And really, that question does apply for this next section alone as well, because you have Kitty Pryde's attitude completely change at this point in the story. But also, she does change her outfit, kind of hint at the idea like, okay, there's something going on in the mind of Kitty Pryde. The question is right now, what? What is causing her to act like this for no actual good reason? But now we have to jump over to a character known as Shrill. Now, this is Shrill's first appearance ever in Marvel Comics, but here's the catch. She only appears in this storyline, and that is it. But kind of Shrill, she has this magical eye that has been created by the same kind of steel that was used to create the Soul Sword as well. And here's the catch. Every single time a Soul Sword is drawn in this dimension, she feels a huge amount of pain. And so what's happening right now for her is to figure out where is the current wielder of the Soul Sword so that she's able to kill that person off so the sword can never be drawn ever again, so that she can no longer feel pain because of the sword. But getting back over to Kitty Pryde, we continue the whole idea that there's something wrong with Kitty Pryde. And the reason why I'm saying that, because we now see her in the room of Muir McTaggart, where you have her going through Muir McTaggart stuff for no actual good reasoning here. Now, you do have Muir McTaggart walk in and wondering, why in the world is Kitty Pryde going through her stuff? And so you have Muir get very upset. Now, for Kitty Pryde, she's acting like a completely different person, completely rude. And so she's kind of like, I don't care what you feel right now, Muir McTaggart. I don't care if you're upset right now. And matter of fact, you have Kitty Pryde begin to attack Muir McTaggart. And after attacking her, she does pull out the Soul Sword out of her body. And it kind of seemed like she is about to kill off Muir McTaggart with the Soul Sword. Now, for Nightcrawler, he does hear the commotion going on upstairs between Kitty Pryde and also Muir McTaggart. So, of course, he begins to freak out. But here's the thing. For Nightcrawler, when he does teleport, he has to go to a different dimension before he's able to end up where he's trying to teleport to. Now, even though he may be in that other dimension for like a matter of a few seconds, it's still long enough to allow somebody to do something to Nightcrawler. Like, for example, Grave Moss. He was in that other dimension. And so you have Grave Moss being able to enter the body of Nightcrawler to now have full control over his body. So now Nightcrawler will be used by Grave Moss to hopefully get the Soul Sword. And so as we dive into the second chapter, we pick up with the idea of, well, Kitty Pryde still trying to kill off Muir McTaggart. Now, luckily for Muir, you do have the different members of Excalibur appear. So you do have Nightcrawler, who's still being controlled by Grave Moss, but also Megan and Captain Britain. Now, you do have Brian being the one to knock out Kitty Pryde just like that. But here comes the problem, though, because you do have Muir McTaggart say, hey, let's go ahead and take her over to the lab to figure out what in the world is going on here. But right after saying that, you now have Nightcrawler, who's still being controlled by Grave Moss, try to pick up the Soul Sword. The Soul Sword then goes away from Nightcrawler back into the body of Kitty Pryde. Now, when that happened, Megan begins to freak out once again. So you have Muir McTaggart say, okay, you know what? Let's go ahead and take both now Megan and Kitty Pryde over to the lab to figure out what in the world is going on here with these two ladies. But now we have to jump over to Shrill. Now, when we do, it's really more of Shrill just right now recovering, because when it came to Kitty Pryde pulling out the Soul Sword earlier, she had felt a huge amount of pain. And so with the Soul Sword now being put away, she's now able to get back up again. But it's her still saying, like, I have to find the person who's currently wielding the Soul Sword and to hopefully stop them before they're able to use it again, because this pain is too much for me to handle. Now, she was able to figure out where Kitty Pryde is at. Of course, Muir Island. So you now have Shrill heading over there as well. But getting back over to Nightcrawler, you have Nightcrawler at the moment, or sorry, Grave Moss, who's in the body of Nightcrawler at the moment on the outside parts of the island. He's trying his best to hide from the camera so that he is able to think of a game plan to get the Soul Sword. Now, that is the moment where you do have Grave Moss be confronted by Amanda. Now, for Amanda, she sees Grave Moss as Nightcrawler. So she's kind of like, hey, it's my boyfriend. Let's go ahead and have a small conversation. But in that small conversation, you have Nightcrawler go out of his way to knock out Amanda and throw her off the cliff and being like, hey, you know what? She's gone now. Now I am able to continue my plans to get the Soul Sword. But now we have to jump over to the med lab for Charles Xavier and Muir McTaggart, because this is where we're going to learn what exactly happened when it came to Soul Sword being passed over to Kitty Pryde. You see, when it came to Illyana's final days while trying to fight against the legacy virus, Charles had cameras all around her. Now, this is a hard moment to watch for Charles Xavier and also Muir McTaggart, but unfortunately, they don't have a choice here. They have to watch the footage to see what in the world happened between Kitty Pryde and Illyana. And so apparently in the final days of Illyana, she had technically passed the Soul Sword on to Kitty Pryde. Now, it wasn't on purpose. It's all because they were friends. When Illyana was still a teenage girl, she became close friends with Kitty Pryde. That bond right there is the reason why Kitty Pryde now possesses the Soul Sword. Now, while everyone realized what exactly happened in the past, the fire alarm goes off. And the reason why, because you had Grave Moss in the body of Nightcrawler set Douglock on fire. So right now, Douglock is just freaking out. He's on fire. Now remember, he is a techno-organic being. He has a techno-organic virus inside of him right now. And so you have our heroes wondering, like, how in the world can we save his life? Now, you do have Grave Moss say, oh, I know a way to how to save his life. And the book changes over to Kitty Pryde. We're kind of left to wonder, what did Grave Moss do to the rest of Excalibur? But that leads into the ending of the second chapter, because we pick up with Kitty Pryde waking up. Now, when she does wake up, she realizes that she remembers everything that happened earlier when it came to her being completely different, having a different attitude thanks to the Soul Sword. Now, you have Kitty Pryde being able to pull out the Soul Sword, but when she does, she is then confronted by Shrill. Now remember, Shrill is only here to make sure the sword is never pulled out ever again, because again, she feels a huge amount of pain when the sword is wielded by its wielder. And so you have Shrill saying, I need the Soul Sword to go away. So I'm kind of hoping not to kill you to make sure it never comes out. But while you have the two ladies talking to one another, you didn't have Grave Moss appear in the body of Nightcrawler. But Grave Moss is acting like a complete strange person. And so you have Kitty wondering what in the world is wrong with Nightcrawler. She has no idea at the moment that that's not Nightcrawler. That's actually Grave Moss. But again, this is the ending of the second chapter, leading us into the third chapter. Now, the first half of the third chapter is really more of Kitty Pryde finding out that Nightcrawler is not Nightcrawler, that in reality is actually Grave Moss in the body of Nightcrawler. Now, really, for Kitty Pryde, she only finds out because of Shrill. Shrill tells her, like, hey, that's not your friend in there at all. That's somebody else in there using his body as a way to hopefully get the soul sword. And so you have Kitty Pryde finding out that, well, Excalibur was taken out earlier by Grave Moss. But either way, it's Kitty Pryde being able to get away, but just barely. Now for Kitty, she knows that sooner or later, she needs to fight against Grave Moss to hopefully defeat him to save Nightcrawler, but to also make sure that Grave Moss cannot get his hands on the soul sword. Now, this leads into a flashback where you had Wolverine teach Kitty Pryde a special type of fighting style. And really, when I saw the cover of the third chapter, I really thought like, okay, cool. We're getting Wolverine in this storyline. This is great. No, we're technically not. Like, yes, it's in the flashback, but that's really it because it's Wolverine teaching Kitty Pryde in the past in the Danger Room a special type of fighting style that belonged to the Jewish people because Kitty Pryde is Jewish. And so it's Wolverine saying like, hey, listen, Kitty Pryde, you need to learn how to fight because just in case your powers do not work, how in the world are you going to be able to protect yourself against different types of enemies? And so once she does learn how to fight, you then have Kitty Pryde begin to use those fighting skills against Grave Moss. And really, the rest of the book is really more about that right there. It's just Kitty Pryde being able to fight against Grave Moss with the skills that Wolverine had taught her many years ago. And so you do have Kitty Pryde being able to hold her own until you do have different characters being able to help her out. So like, for example, you do have Shrill appear. Now, Shrill's not really helpful because with the soul sword being out, she's feeling a huge amount of pain at the moment. But luckily for Kitty Pryde, Amanda reappeared because Amanda realized there was something off about Nightcrawler earlier. So she did not die earlier. But when she does reappear, with a combination of Kitty Pryde and also Amanda, they were able to get rid of Grave Moss and get him out of the body of Nightcrawler. Now, here's the thing. You have Amanda tell Kitty, go ahead and give me the soul sword. I'll make sure the soul sword does not fall in the wrong hands ever again, but also to get rid of Grave Moss. So we're kind of left with the idea that maybe there's a possibility Grave Moss was killed off by Amanda, but after getting rid of Grave Moss, now the last page of the book is really more of us finding out that when it comes to Amanda, she had gave the soul sword over to her mother. Now that is actually a problem because Margali was also on the winding way path as well, like Grave Moss was. And so is Amanda realizing that Margali can now use the soul sword as a way to kind of defeat the people ahead of her on the winding way to gain more power at a faster rate. Okay, so it's time for us to go ahead and get back into our coverage over the X-Men. And so, of course, we got to pick up with some good old Excalibur. Now, here's the thing, because in my last video I did when it came to covering Legion Quest, I have mentioned the fact that when it came to all the different X books leading into Age of Apocalypse, they all kind of ended the same type of way. And what I mean is that at the very end of each X book, you had your X team or X hero going through a certain moment, except at the very end of the book, they all returned to crystals. And the reason why, because, well, their timeline was technically ending and a brand new timeline was coming to life, the Age of Apocalypse timeline. And so for the next few videos we're going to do when it comes to our coverage over the X-Men, we're going to see that right there, where you're going to see each book end on that same type of note where it's like, oh my God, can our heroes pass this certain moment they're going through? But then at the very end, they're frozen in time and completely erased to bring in a new version of themselves from the Age of Apocalypse timeline. Now, something else I do want to mention when it comes to Excalibur issue number 86 is that it's bringing back the whole idea of Genosha. Now, Genosha plays a very important role when it comes to X-Men comics. And let me explain why. Because in the early days of X-Men comics, when it came to Genosha, we were kind of told that it was this perfect country. They had no issues at all inside their country. But in reality, they had a lot of problems. You see, inside the country, what they did was they took mutants and turned them into slaves as a way to help build up their country. Now, thanks to the X-Men getting involved, you then had the old government go away and a new one came in to allow mutants and humans to be equal to one another. The problem was that right after that, they were then hit by the legacy virus. Now, the legacy virus played a major plot line at this point in time in X-Men comics. The legacy virus was brought back in time by Strife as a way to attack the mutant race by killing them off one by one, left and right, across the entire world. The problem is now the legacy virus has supposedly evolved, and now it's going after humans as well. Now, by this point in Marvel's timeline, it's only one human who has been affected by the legacy virus, and that would be Muir Taggart. Now, for me personally, I kind of feel like this was Marvel back then in the 1990s trying to tell us like, hey, guys, what if Muir Taggart is a mutant and not just a human? But hey, that's just me. But either way, when it came to Genosha, the legacy virus hit that country pretty hard. A lot of mutants died, but that took place over in X Factor Comics. So we have not seen Genosha in a very long time. We have no idea how they are since that moment where the legacy virus hit them pretty hard. But this video, we're going to learn things got even worse in that country. But before we are able to properly pick up what's happening in Genosha, we have to jump over to a different country, and that would be Thailand. Now, really, we're going to pick up in a small area in that country called, and guys, I am going to mispronounce the name, Rastafan. Now, Rastafan was an old airstrip / base that was used by the CIA in the Vietnam War. But of course, by this point, they had abandoned the place. But the problem is, after they had left, you had different terrorist groups being able to work out of that old base. The problem is that that old base was a tad bit too close to Great Britain. So they had a big problem with the whole idea of a terrorist group working out of that base. And so they had sent in a character known as Peter Wisdom, a mutant, to go ahead and kill off every single person who was a terrorist working inside that base. And so for Peter, it was one of the worst jobs he ever did because he was now wishing that he had quit a long time ago because he had killed so many people inside that one place. But now we have to jump over to Brian Braddock, and technically not at first, because at first we do pick up with this moment in time where we see all these different people who may be from Genosha being scared of what's happening around them. They were basically saying that this is the apocalypse. But we also see a guy who looks like Peter Wisdom getting shot by a bunch of bullets. Now, with all that being said, we then jump over to Brian Braddock. And this is where we're reminded that for Brian Braddock, he was lost in time for a good period in time in Excalibur comics. But while being lost in time, the dude saw a lot of different things about the main Marvel Universe timeline. And so every once in a while, he has a small episode where he sees different flashes of different things to come down the road when it comes to the main Marvel Universe timeline. But the thing is, while he had one of those episodes,
he was working on the hovercraft that belonged to Muir McTaggart. Now, for Muir McTaggart, she hates the idea that her hovercraft was even touched by Brian Braddock. Like, yes, Excalibur has the right to use it, but to her, she loved the way her hovercraft looked. And now she hates the idea of how it looks right now. Like, the man gave it a whole bunch of different upgrades to supposedly help Excalibur out in the field. Now, with all that being said, you didn't have Kitty Pryde say, hey, listen, we need all hands on deck right now up in the observation room. And the only reason why she said that because she realized that there was some aircraft that's flying around Muir Island over and over and over again. And so because of that, she's kind of like, hey, listen, I find this a tad bit sketchy, but then you have that aircraft being able to communicate with Kitty Pryde, asking, hey, can we land on Muir Island? Because we came here for a very good reason. And so this kind of leads into a callback to the early days of Excalibur, because in the old days, there was this intelligence group known as WHO, and it stands for Weird Happening Organization. They would go around the world to investigate weird things happening across the world, but especially in Great Britain. But by this point in Marvel's timeline, the entire group is completely gone. But the thing was, they had been replaced by a brand new organization, and that would be Black Air. Now, we do pick up with 3 agents, Michelle, Threadgold, and also Pete Wisdom. Now, apparently, they came here for a special reason, and the reason why, because what's happening over in Genosha. Now, like I said earlier, when it comes to Genosha, they had gone through a lot in a very short period of time. But the last time we saw them, a bunch of mutants were dying by the hands of the legacy virus. And the thing is, to kind of find out, things have gotten worse. The entire economy had basically crashed. And so now you have mutants and humans fighting against each other all over the country. Now, at first, the mutants, they had the advantage. And the reason why? Because they have powers. Humans don't. But then out of nowhere, humans were able to get a special type of bullets to use on mutants. And so right now, the humans have the advantage over the mutant race. And that right there is a huge problem. So for Black Air, what they want to do is send Excalibur into Genosha to kind of stop both sides from fighting against one another, but to also learn more about this special type of bullet. Now, while you have the entire conversation going on, we get the idea that Pete Wisdom does not like Excalibur at all, but especially Brian Braddock. Now, unfortunately, we do not learn why this man has so much hatred for Brian in this video, but after Age of Apocalypse, we're going to learn a whole lot more about Brian Braddock's family, especially his father. But now we have to jump over to Douglock and also Rory Campbell. Now remember, when it comes to Douglock, he is a phalanx. Now he was only created off the dead cells of 2 different characters, Doug Ramsey and also Warlock. Now, Doug Ramsey died back in Fall of the Mutants, and for Warlock, he also died but in a different storyline, better known as the Extinction Agenda. Now, with all that being said, when it came to the Phalanx, they were able to create Douglock out of those 2 characters' dead cells. The problem was he was still technically a mutant in some ways, and so he was able to break away from the rest of the Phalanx. He's still a robot that's trying his best to learn everything about the world, especially human feelings. Now, I want to focus more on Rory Campbell here, because remember, we had saw in an earlier storyline that there's a huge possibility that Rory Campbell might turn into a character known as Ahab. Now remember, Ahab is an evil character from a different timeline, better known as the Days of Future Past timeline, where Rachel Summers comes from, and he saw his future self. And so his main goal is to make sure that he does not turn into that character at all. But let's jump over to Nightcrawler because, like I said earlier, when it comes to the legacy virus, there's only one person right now technically affected by the virus who's a human, and that would be Muir Taggart. And so for Nightcrawler, he was able to figure out who that person could be because he said, listen, I only know two humans right now that have been working on the legacy virus. That's Muir Taggart and also Rory Campbell. And so for Nightcrawler, he said, it's you. It has to be you, the one human who have been affected by the legacy virus. And so Muir Taggart, she hates the idea of admitting the truth, but at the same time, she now knows that other people are going to figure out that she has now been affected by the legacy virus. But she tells Nightcrawler, just leave and go help out Genosha, please. And this kind of leads into the ending of today's storyline because with this story that Warren Ellis was working on, it did get interrupted with the whole idea of Age of Apocalypse. You see what I mean here in a moment, but you do have our heroes head over to Genosha. Now, when they do arrive there, they realize that it's a pretty bad state right now for Genosha. You have all these different mutants out there trying their best to survive, humans as well. Buildings are destroyed. It looks completely horrible. But things get even worse because for our heroes, as they're flying over Genosha and getting a good look of the country, they are then hit by some missiles. And so unfortunately, they're now about to crash into Genosha. But like I said earlier, when it came to Legion Quest, at this point in time in Marvel Comics, by the end of that storyline, you had all the different X books in on the same type of note where you had our X heroes, our X characters be frozen in time and then completely erased because a new world was coming into picture, the Age of Apocalypse. So for our heroes, they're now crashing towards Genosha, but at the very last second, they are completely frozen in time. And just like that, we then go into, well, Age of Apocalypse, where this series was replaced with a different series. And that series was called Excalibur, but we'll cover that series as we dive into Age of Apocalypse. But this is where we're going to end today's comic book video. So please, leave me a like down below and subscribe. But guys, see y'all next time. Later. Okay, so it's time for us to, well, begin our coverage, or really working our way up to the Onslaught storyline for the X-Men. And honestly, I'm kind of hyped to cover that massive event because the Onslaught event did do a lot of different things for the Marvel Universe in the mid to late 1990s. Not just for the X-Men, but for the Avengers and also the Hulk, Fantastic Four, and the list goes on. Now, to begin our coverage, really working our way up to the Onslaught saga, it all began with X-Men Prime issue number 1. And X-Men Prime issue number 1 was really more of kind of like, okay, you know what? We just wrapped up Age of Apocalypse. We're now going back into the original reality for the X-Men. And so with all that being said, we're going to bring back all the titles that you were reading prior to Age of Apocalypse. Wolverine, Cable, X-Men, Uncanny X-Men, and the list goes on. But also giving us new books as well. But when it came to X-Men Prime, it's more of like, okay, this is the starting point of our new fresh beginning for the X-Men. You read this book right here to figure out what is all the different X-teens or X-characters are currently going through and what other things could pop off for our heroes as we begin this new era for X-Men comics. So X-Men Prime number 1 did a lot of different things for the X-Men. And so as we dive into the opening pages of this storyline, we're picking up with Jean Grey. Now for Jean Grey, we see her going out into the woods near the school of Charles Xavier, where she does find Wolverine. Now, by this point in Marvel Comics, Wolverine had lost the adamantium that was attached to his bones thanks to Weapon X. And so with that now being gone, it's just Wolverine with bone claws. Now, for Wolverine, he had finally came back home to the school of Charles Xavier. The problem is that, well, Sabretooth is also there because before Age of Apocalypse, for Charles Xavier, he truly believed in the idea that he could cure the mind of Sabretooth, turn that character into a good person. But for Wolverine, he knows how truly evil Sabretooth is. And so he told Jean Grey and the rest of the X-Men, as long as Sabretooth stays in that school, Wolverine will not be going inside at all. If they need him, they know how to reach him. Now, when it comes to Bishop in this one particular issue, we do learn that for Bishop, he's kind of going through a lot. And here's the reason why. Because for Bishop, he was a character who was technically able to live a life in the alternate reality, better known as Age of Apocalypse. When it came to Legion killing off Charles Xavier, which of course brought in that brand new timeline, when you had all the different X characters disappear because a brand new timeline was coming into the picture, Bishop did not. And here's the reason why. Because Bishop is a man at a time. We have no idea what timeline Bishop comes from just yet. Either way though, when it came to Bishop, when you had all the different X characters disappeared, Bishop did not. He was able to live a life in that alternate reality. Now, when he went back in time to stop Legion from being able to kill off Magneto or Charles Xavier, you had the older version of Bishop share what he had experienced in that alternate timeline to his younger self. And so now for present day Bishop in this reality here, he's kind of having dreams of different things the other Bishop had experienced over in the Age of Apocalypse timeline. And so for Charles Xavier, he does not truly understand what's going on with the mind of Bishop because technically no one knows about that alternate reality. But now we pick up with a character known as Dennis Hogan. Now, Dennis Hogan is going to be used as a way for the X-Men to know what's to come for their future. Like, what is going to happen across the world when it comes to mutants versus humans. And you'll see what I mean as we go through the next few sections of this storyline. Really, the next section really shows you what's going to happen because we have to transition over to Trish Tilby. Now, Trish Tilby is better known as the somewhat girlfriend to Beast. Like, technically they are dating, but we really haven't seen them together in a very long time. Now, for Trish, she is a reporter. And here's the thing, because she has amassed a story that's going to change everything when it comes to mutants and humans. And the whole idea of that story is about the legacy virus. Now, we have not talked about the virus in a very long time, but the virus came from the future where Cable and Strife are from. When it came to Strife, he had released the virus out in the past, or in our case, the present day. And the virus was originally killing off mutants across the world at a very rapid pace. But now the virus is beginning to target humans as well. And right now, there's only one case, and that would be Muir McTaggart. But the thing is, the rest of the world does not really know about the legacy virus. Well, they're about to find out about the virus. But we have to transition over to X Factor. Now for X Factor, they're going after Mystique, kind of picking up where we last saw them prior to Age of Apocalypse. Now, it's also Mystique trying her best to do some damage to a nearby Sentinel facility. But while you have Forge trying his best to turn off the bomb that she had planted, you have the rest of the X Factor team try their best to chase her down. Except for Mystique, as she's trying to get away, somebody is able to attack her and knock her out. Now, Val Cooper finds her, but the question is right now, who had attacked Mystique? Now we have to begin the idea of us learning that there's something going on with the X-Men. Like, besides Bishop and also possibly Wolverine, we have something going on with Storm. Really, somebody close to Storm, because you have Beast and Cyclops making dinner for everybody, but they have to deliver dinner over to Storm. Now, why you have the two characters heading over to where Storm could be at, you then have Bishop appear. And with Bishop appearing, he begins to attack both Beast and Cyclops, because his mind right now is having flashbacks to the Age of Apocalypse timeline. And in that timeline, Beast was evil, better known as Dark Beast, and when it came to Cyclops, he was evil at first, but he turned good at the end of that storyline. But for Bishop, in reality, all he remembers was Beast was evil and so was Cyclops. So when they walk by Bishop, he begins to attack them. Now you do have our two heroes being able to bring Bishop back into reality, kind of like, dude, what in the world are you even talking about? You said we're working for the High Lord. Who in the world is the High Lord? And so for Bishop, he's kind of wondering what in the world is going on with his mind. But while that was going on, for Dennis, he arrived at the diner. Now, at this diner, there is a TV. And this TV is going to be really important when it comes to Trish telling the world about the mutant race and the legacy virus. But for Dennis, we get the idea that, yes, he is a mutant, but he might transform into a different form that could scare everyone in that room. But now we can go ahead and begin to talk about a fan favorite character, because while working on our coverage over the X-Men, you guys were waiting for this moment to get our first look of Marrow. But technically, this is not her first appearance in Marvel Comics. We met Marrow as a child back in Cable issue number 15. When it came to the Morlocks, as we all know, most of them were killed off in the Mutant Massacre. Now you fast forward, you then have Michael, the older brother to Colossus, kill off the rest of the Morlocks, but some of them did technically stay alive, and one of them was Marrow. Now she was a child who came out of the darkness to tell Cable and Domino that, hey, listen, the rest of the Morlocks who are with me, we're not technically ready to come out of hiding. But here comes the big catch. She was a child. As we see her right now, she's now a grown woman. What in the world happened to her? How in the world did she age so fast? But now we can learn about what's going on with Storm. And technically, it's just Storm watching over Gambit, because at the end of Legion Quest, you had our heroes believe that it was going to be the end of the world. And so for Gambit and Rogue, they had kissed as their final kiss, their final moment with one another. The problem was that with Rogue's powers, it put Gambit into a coma. Now here's the thing, because we also learned that when it came to Rogue, when she had absorbed Gambit's mind into her own mind, she saw a dark secret about Gambit, and it scared her, and it made her run away. And so for Storm, she's kind of wondering, what did Rogue see in his mind to make her just leave the X-Men behind completely? And so we see Rogue just out there, clubbing, dancing, having a good old time. She's not alone. She's with Bobby Drake, better known as Iceman. Now, there's a small situation at the bar where you have a guy trying to, confront Rogue, trying to get mad at her. And you have Iceman handle that very easily. But while you have the two people in the club, you have them realize that Trish is on TV. And this is Trish about to change the entire world for the mutants, but also the humans. Because now it's her telling the entire world about the whole idea of the legacy virus, how the virus killing off mutants left and right, but the virus that was originally only targeting mutants is now targeting humans. And with the humans already hating on mutants for so many different things, with this being out there, you are now straight up saying like, hey, listen, if you are a human and you get the legacy virus, you might have the right to blame the mutants for the reason why you have the virus. You are basically putting targets on every single mutant across the entire world. And so you have some of the X teams kind of see this announcement and kind of wondering where this could possibly go. But like I said, with that announcement, you now have humans out there wanting to hurt mutants. So you now have all these different humans in the same diner with Dennis kind of wondering what will happen to them if they get the virus. Now, for Dennis, he begins to freak out and he leaves in a hurry. And so you have this group of people automatically believe that he must be some kind of mutant and they need to follow him and possibly kill him as a way to not spread the legacy virus around. And you have the X-Men watching the news, and they realize that with Trish, the girlfriend of Beast, announcing this to the entire world, it really does bother Beast a lot because now it's her betraying the entire mutant race. It's her betraying him because now again, like I said earlier, all of these different mutants have targets on their back. Now, for Charles Xavier, he does inform Scott Summers that he wants to talk to Cable. But right when he says that, you have some kind of massive psychic feedback hit the mind of both Psylocke and also Charles Xavier. And so for Cyclops and the rest of the X-Men, they're kind of wondering what in the world just happened to Charles Xavier and also Psylocke. Like, who could do this to them? And we kind of find out it's Nate Gray from the Age of Apocalypse timeline. Some of the characters of that timeline were able to come over into this reality. And Nate Gray is one of the 3 characters that we are going to see in this reality now. Now, we also kind of have to build up what's going on with the Generation X team because before Age of Apocalypse, they were a brand new team, only had 4 issues, and then their series had to stop because of that event. And so now with all these other X books being able to resume where they had left off at prior from Age of Apocalypse, we got to build up each of those books, including Generation X. And so we pick up with Implate. Now, we don't know much about Implate, but we see him paying a visit over to the home of a character known as Gala. And apparently he wants to get information from Gala about a particular mutant who's part of the Generation X team, and that would be Chambers. So we're now kind of wondering, why does Implate want Chambers so much for? But I want to jump back over to Dennis because you have Dennis trying his best to make it over to the school of Charles Xavier, the home of the X-Men. But the problem is that while trying to do that, he gets surrounded by all those different humans from the diner. And so with those humans now surrounding him and kind of making him panic a tad bit, he begins to transform into this lizard form of his. Now, it does seem like possibly the legacy virus is inside of him, and it does weaken him a tad bit after he does transform into his lizard form. And so you do have these humans begin to beat down on him. But while you have all those different humans beating him down, you didn't have him cry out mentally. And luckily for him, he is near the school of Charles Xavier because you have Charles pick up on his mental cries. And so you have Storm and Charles leave to hopefully get to him in time to help him. And you have Charles call in the rest of the X-Men to follow. Now, we do pick up with X-Force. Now, around this time in Marvel Comics, when it came to X-Force, they had constantly changed their bases around. And so around this time, they were staying at the old base that belonged to Arcade. And with that being said, you had Arcade appear as a hologram to kind of warn X-Force that he now knows that they're at his old base. And so you have you have Arcade begin the process of a self-destruct sequence in the base. So X-Force only have like less than a few seconds to get the heck out of there, which they were able to do. But right after you have X-Force being able to get out of the base in time, they are then confronted by Cyclops, because again, Charles Xavier did ask Cyclops to find Cable. Now, there is a small issue when it comes to X-Force, because in this issue alone, apparently they had handled the whole situation that was going on with Sunspot being a different character known as Rainfire. But to tell you the truth, the whole Rainfire situation won't be handled until later issues of X-Force. Now, for X Factor, they're kind of going through a different situation. Now, I'm going to skip over the whole idea of Mystique once again. The reason why, because it's Mystique trying to pretend to be Val Cooper, but Forge knows Val Cooper so well that he knows it's Mystique pretending to be Val. But once you have Forge knock out Mystique, you have Forge and Val being able to take Mystique over to their aircraft, you then have it kind of act strange. Like, he's unable to control his powers, and so he has to release a huge amount of energy. But when he does, he damaged the dam they were trying to protect earlier, releasing a huge amount of water. And so you have our heroes wondering what in the world is going on with Havoc. Now, there's something else I do want to talk about, and that would be the Sugarman, because like I said earlier, you had some characters from the Age of Apocalypse timeline come over to the main Marvel universe. Now, for Nate Gray, he arrived in the present day. Sugarman did not, because Sugarman, when he arrived in the main Marvel universe, he arrived at the exact moment where you had Bishop being able to stop Legion from killing off Magneto or possibly Charles Xavier. And so because of that, it took place 20 years in the past, allowing the Sugarman to work in the shadows for 20 years. So everything that was going on with Genosha is because of the Sugarman. Now, some members of Excalibur were able to find some documents that kind of prove that the Sugarman is behind everything. The problem is that a Sugarman does not want anyone to know that he is here. And so you had a Sugarman blow up the mutant that was a slave prior the whole idea of slaves being free in Genosha, blew him up while he was holding documents that kind of prove the Sugarman is the one in charge of Genosha. And so for Excalibur, they don't know what happened to that mutant, but on top of that, they have no idea who is really in control of Genosha. But now we have to jump over to the Acolytes, because the Acolytes will have their own storyline in our future coverage over the X-Men. Now, for the Acolytes, they're out there in space. And remember, these people really do praise Magneto like he's some kind of god. Now, at this moment in time, Magneto is currently kind of brain dead thanks to Charles Xavier shutting down the mind of Magneto. But with that being said, you have the Acolytes realize that there's something out there in the middle of space. And so you have the Acolytes go out of their way to try to retrieve that item. Now, when they get closer, all they find is huge block of ice that they're not really able to melt down. But you didn't have the Acolytes realize there's somebody or something that's stuck inside the ice, and most likely it is alive. Now, there is another character that was able to come into this reality, and that would be Dark Beast. Now, for Dark Beast, like Sugarman, he arrived in the past, the same time point where you had Bishop stop Legion from killing off Charles Xavier and Magneto, or one of the two. But for Dark Beast, he arrived 20 years in the past, and just like Sugarman, he worked behind the scenes. But here comes the big catch, because we do learn here that Dark Beast could be the actual person behind the creation of the Marauders. Now, as we go through our coverage over the X-Men, we're going to learn more about Dark Beast and what he did in this reality, and how him being here in this reality truly did affect everything we covered so far when it comes to the X-Men. But you have Dark Beast find Marrow. Now, when he finds Marrow, he realized that technically she is one of his creations, just 2 generations from the original point of him working on the Morlocks. But now we have to pick up with the X-Men as we get into the ending of this storyline. And when we do, we're really picking up with the idea of the X-Men arriving where Dennis is at. Now, for Dennis, he has been badly beaten by those humans who were following him earlier. And so once you have the X-Men arrive, you have Dennis die in the arms of Charles Xavier. But with his death, it's kind of hinting at the idea that darker times are coming for all the different X teams. And the question is right now, are they truly ready for what's to come down the road for X-Men, for X Factor, Excalibur, Generation X, and the list goes on all the different X books that we have to cover. But Okay, so it's time for us to go ahead and get back into our coverage over Excalibur. And it has been a very long time since we last talked about Excalibur because of, well, we were covering Age of Apocalypse. And so, with us now being done with that event and getting back over to the main Marvel Universe, we got to pick back up with some good old Excalibur. Now, technically, we're only covering one issue, and the reason why, because the next storyline we have to cover is a 3-part story, or it really does focus on Kitty Pryde and Pete Wisdom as they go on their own special mission, but also the possibility of those two characters becoming a couple. Yeah, you heard that right. She falls in love with another Peter character. Either way, for Excalibur, we have to remember what happened prior from Age of Apocalypse. You see, when it came to Excalibur 86, you had the Excalibur team be confronted by 2 members of the Black Air organization. Now, Black Air is replacing the WHO organization we saw in the early parts of our coverage over Excalibur. And WHO stand for Weird Happening Organization. They just go around the world to investigate weird things happening across the world. But with WHO no longer being around, they were replaced with Black Air. Now, for Black Air, they came to Excalibur about what was happening over in Genosha. Now, we have talked a lot about Genosha before because Genosha does play a major role in X-Men comics. See, for Genosha, it was this small island, this small country out in Africa where if you go there, you're supposed to get the perfect life that everybody wants because they were trying to paint this picture that everything is perfect in Genosha. But here comes the big catch. You see, in Genosha, if you were a mutant, you were turned into a slave. And so you had the humans use mutants as a way to build up the economy of Genosha. Now, thanks to the X-Men, X-Factor, and X-Force, you had mutants no longer be slaves in Genosha. And so it was supposed to be a brand new beginning for that country where mutants and humans would be able to live together in harmony. But here comes the big problem. Because for Excalibur, they got word that a civil war had technically popped off in Genosha, where you now have humans and mutants fighting against one another. But the reason why you have Excalibur getting involved is because of a special bullet that was technically made to kill off mutants. And so you now have the humans in Genosha using those bullets as a way to kill off the mutants in Genosha. And so for Excalibur, you have Black Air Asgard heroes to go over to Genosha to kind of figure out the actual origin of the bullet, but to also find a way to stop the civil war from happening in Genosha between the humans and the mutants. And so when it came to Excalibur, when they had flew over to Genosha to begin their investigation, they were shot out of the sky. Now, when it came to Legion Quest, you had Legion go back in time to kill off Magneto. As we all know, he killed off Charles Xavier. So with the death of Charles Xavier, you kind of had all the different X books be affected as well because the old timeline, this timeline, was being replaced with a brand new timeline, the Age of Apocalypse timeline. And so all the different X books ended the same way, with our heroes being frozen in time. And so when it came to Excalibur, they were shot out of the sky, and as they were falling, they were also being frozen in time because, again, Legion Quest happened. Now, thanks to Bishop, the old timeline came back together, but it picked up where everyone was left off at. And so for Excalibur, they picked up right where they left off at, falling out of the sky. And so as we get into the opening pages of the storyline, it's really more of Excalibur working together to just find a way to get their aircraft to go right back up before they crash into the ground, where luckily they were able to achieve that. Now, when it comes to Pete Wisdom, like I said earlier, he does work for Black Air. But the thing is, it does seem like to be some kind of deal done between the two parties. Like apparently he was kind of forced to work for Black Air. Now, for Pete, he's always working for different organizations. He's a spy. But this kind of organization, it does seem like there's something going on behind the scenes. And for Pete, he hates the idea of what is going on behind the scenes with Black Air. But for Excalibur, they don't really trust Pete at all. And so for the next few story arcs, kind of seems like going to be Pete trying his best to show Excalibur that they can trust him and vice versa, trying to build that bond between everybody. But either way, you didn't have Excalibur say, you know what, let's go ahead, go out to Genosha and try to investigate where is the actual origin point of this special bullet that's being used as a way to kill off mutants. And so for Excalibur, when they do go to one certain part of Genosha, they do find this group of mutants who are just starving for food. And the problem is that because of the Civil War, it's really hard for food to be delivered into this country. Now, here's the thing, because while you do have the mutants begin to talk to the different members of Excalibur, you do have some of the humans who live in Genosha who are currently wearing bodysuits and using weapons as a way to hunt down mutants in this country. And so now we're seeing a small battle of this Civil War. And unfortunately for Excalibur, they're stuck right in the middle. Now for our heroes, their main goal at first is to go after the humans, because these mutants were just innocent people who were just walking around and expressing how hungry they are. And that's really it. But now being attacked by a group of humans who hate them because what happened to their country. It's them blaming the mutants for the change in their country. But while you have our heroes fighting against those humans, you then have another group of mutants appear. Now, this group of mutants, they're only here to kill off the humans who was attacking the first group of mutants. And so for Nightcrawler and the rest of Excalibur, they now have to fight against two different groups. And the reason why, because they're trying to prevent bloodshed happening from this one particular battle. Now, with all that being said, for Pete Wisdom, he does try his best not to get involved. But the problem is that you have one of the mutants think that Pete Wisdom is a human and try to kill him off because humans in this country must be racist. But for Pete Wisdom, he is a mutant. And so he had no choice but to use his mutant ability as a way to protect himself, but also take down that mutant. But after doing that, it's Pete saying like, I did not want to use my mutant ability, but I had no choice. Now, we also have to remember about the Sugarman, because when it came to X-Men Prime, we had technically learned that when it came to the Sugarman, when he had left the Age of Apocalypse timeline and went back into the main Marvel Universe, well, he had arrived 20 years in the past. And so he was kind of able to work behind the scenes when it came to Genosha. And so for Genosha, the entire country was built up thanks to Sugarman and his own crazy ideas. But for our heroes, they have no idea about Sugarman. One, because he came here into the reality 20 years ago in the past. But two, he has been working behind the scenes. Now, they did find a mutant who may know some information about the origin of Genosha, but the problem was that when it came to our heroes in that one mutant, when they found that information, you had Sugarman blow him up as a way to keep him a secret, but it also make sure any information that mutant was holding also got burned up as well. And so for our heroes, they have no idea what is the actual origin of Genosha. Like, who is the one right now pulling all these different strings? Now, I kind of want to go ahead and jump back over to Muir Island. The reason why, because for Moira McTaggart, she has the legacy virus. And we have talked a lot about the virus. Just know that it's a virus that came from the future thanks to Strife. And once he had released the virus into the world, it was killing off mutants. Unfortunately, it also began to kill off humans. Well, hasn't killed a human yet, but there is one human who has the legacy virus, and that is Moira McTaggart. But it's her right now trying to figure out where is the security breach? Because Trish Tilby was able to get information about the legacy virus, and she shared that information to the entire world. But the question is right now, how did she get her information? Because it was top secret. Like the X-Men, X-Factor, X-Force, the American government, their main goal was to keep the virus hush hush. But now the entire world knows about it. Now, I kind of want to jump over to two characters, one being the governor of Genosha, being Ransom, and also Brian Braddock. Now, for Brian Braddock, man, he was going through a lot during his time in Excalibur, but I'm not really going to sit down and re-explain what's happening with Brian at the moment. I kind of want to focus on what's being told to him by Governor Ransom. And here's the reason why. Because for Brian Braddock, him and Excalibur are there to figure out where the bullet came from. Well, is Ransom telling him that the bullet came from Great Britain? But here comes the big catch, because it all came from one particular mutant known as Pizer. Now, for Pizer, he was apparently being held as a hostage or a prisoner at a military base, and his skin was being ripped off by machines, and his skin was being turned into bullets that's currently being used right now in Genosha as a way to kill off mutants. But here comes the big catch, because the one person who had worked on that project, who took that skin and turned that skin into bullets, was Brian Braddock's father. And so it's Brian kind of realizing that this is his own family's fault for what's currently happening right now in Genosha. And so this kind of leads into the ending, because we see our heroes meeting up with a character known as Philip Moreau. Now, for Philip Moreau, he is the son to a character known as David Moreau. And for David, he was the guy who had created the whole idea of turning mutants into slaves. And that right there is very crucial. Let me explain why. Because it was him kind of turn all the mutants in Genosha as slaves to help build up the economy. But here comes the big catch, because for our heroes, they break into his old lab. They break into his computer. They get information where they discover that technically David did not create the whole process of mutants being turned to slaves. That apparently somebody gave him the equipment he needed, but also the idea and how to do it. Now we already know who. It was the Sugarman. But for our heroes, they don't know that still. And so as they're trying their best to get more and more information, they also discovered that every single piece of information dates back to where you had the Genosha country begin to turn mutants into slaves. But there's no data prior from those dates. And so again, no one knows the actual origin of Genosha yet. And Sugarman, he goes out of his way to blow up that computer to make sure that nobody is able to figure out who he is, or he is the one working behind the scenes. And so the book kind of ends on the note where you have Black Air kind of wondering, like, with Excalibur and also other people keep looking into the origin of Genosha, the true origin should finally be free. They should be able to kind of figure out what is actually happening here in Genosha. And so with that being said, okay, so getting back into our coverage over the X-Men, we're going to go ahead and jump back over to some more Excalibur comics. Now, we're going to cover a 3-part storyline called The Dream Nails. Now, for me personally, The Dream Nails is just a storyline to help establish the idea of Kitty Pryde getting with Pete Wisdom. Now, here's the thing, because around this time in Marvel Comics, Kitty Pryde was not with Colossus. Colossus had officially left the X-Men, joined the Acolytes, and the Acolytes were a group of characters who were praising Magneto like he was some kind of god, but also kind of taking care of Magneto because Charles Xavier had shut down the mind of Magneto. And so with Colossus no longer with the X-Men, but also kind of moving farther away from Kitty Pryde, it allowed Kitty Pryde the chance to go ahead and officially move on to somebody else. And of course, that would be Pete Wisdom. Now, technically, in our last video, we saw it coming. Like, the way they were acting, you can say like, yeah, y'all two are going to get together very soon, knowing Marvel Comics. Now, the storyline does start off in Excalibur issue number 88. And now we get an opening page where we pick up with some kind of alien. Now, this alien is technically locked away, but apparently while being locked away, it had gained some kind of infection. And so with that infection, it's slowly dying off. But you did have this alien begin to laugh. And the reason why, because apparently it had killed a soldier while being held captive in its cell. That soldier believed it was perfectly safe to go inside, but unfortunately that soldier had died. And so we're kind of left to wonder, what kind of alien is this? And what kind of facility are they locked away in? But now we can transition over to Pete Wisdom. Now, around this time in Marvel Comics, for Pete Wisdom, he was working for an organization better known as Black Air. And Black Air around his time in Marvel Comics was a new organization that had just replaced an old one better known as WHO. Now, WHO had stand for Weird Happening Organization. They would go around the world to investigate weird things happening across the world. Now, they're no longer around. They have been officially replaced by Black Air. And for Pete Wisdom, he works for Black Air. Now, for Pete, he's also with Excalibur. And the reason why, because they're supposed to figure out what's going on with Genosha. And technically, what's going on with Genosha is not really important for today's storyline. But for Pete Wisdom, he's with Excalibur on Muir Island, their home base. And so he does ask the computer to connect to his answering machine. Now, when he does that, the very last message comes from a friend better known as Coley. Now, for Coley, it's him saying like, hey, Pete, I need some medical attention, the private kind, but also I need to tell you something very important about our mutual employer. And of course, he's talking about Black Air. Now, here's the problem, because for Pete Wisdom, he does not really have a strong bond with the members of Excalibur just yet. And so when you have Pete go ask Brian, like, hey, can I borrow your jet? Like, can I borrow the Midnight Runner to go over to London to go see my friend? You have, you have Brian say, go play in traffic, basically saying no, but also like, hey, go away and stay away. Now, for Pete Wisdom, he's really trying his best to hopefully change the mind of Brian to allow him to use the Midnight Runner. Now, luckily for Kitty Pryde, she is there. And here's the thing, because Kitty Pryde knows how to actually control, how to pilot the Midnight Runner. Pete does not, which was another reason why Brian said no. But with Kitty Pryde now going, and because she knows how to pilot the aircraft, you have Brian say yes, and the two of them leave to go find this mysterious friend of Pete. Now, we also have to remember that around this time in Marvel Comics, Moira McTaggart is dying. And the reason why, because of the legacy virus. Now, we have talked a lot about the legacy virus. It came from the future thanks to Strife, and you have Strife released the virus into the present day. And the thing is, the virus was only going after mutants. That was it. But now it's going after humans as well. Now, technically, it's only one human, and that would be Moira McTaggart. And that is really it. But you had the word get out about the virus to the public. And that was a major problem for the X-Men, because their main goal was to make sure the public did not find out about the virus. Because if they did, you're going to have humans hate on mutants even more, because that virus was originally only going after mutants, but now it's no longer just going after mutants, it's now going after humans. And so now you have the humans blame the mutants for the idea of the legacy virus. Now, here's the problem though, because Trish Tilby was the one who had told the entire world about the legacy virus. But the problem was, again, the X-Men want to keep everything hush hush. How in the world did that info get out into the public? And you have Moira McTaggart say, you know what? It all makes sense now, because for Charles Xavier, his computer, and Moira McTaggart, her computer, they are connected, but they are connected by a satellite. But when it came to Charles Xavier, his home was being attacked by the Phalanx, and he wanted to make sure the Phalanx would not be able to access his information. And so he tried his best to wipe his computer clean, but also he wiped out security as well. And so for a hacker, they now had easy access into the satellite over to Moira McTaggart's computer. And so with that hacker, they were able to collect information about the legacy virus. Now, for Kitty Pryde and also Pete Wisdom, they're heading over to London. And really, for Kitty Pryde, she's kind of enjoying the idea of being with Pete Wisdom. And the reason why, because with him being a spy, with him working for Black Air, she's kind of seeing all the different benefits a spy can truly have. Like, for example, there are secret hangars around London that Black Air owns. And to the public, they're not really hangars. They're different types of facilities. So for Kitty Pryde, it's kind of cool that they now have a place to place the Midnight Runner without the possibility of it being taken away. But I also like the idea of these two characters kind of hanging out, because we're slowly seeing the two characters come together. But it's also like Pete Wisdom and also Kitty Pryde kind of showing us that their relationship at the moment is not that strong, because for Pete, he's kind of like, hey, Kitty, you could have stayed behind at the Midnight Runner. But it's her saying like, let me get this straight. You're going to run around all London by yourself with no kind of backup and also kind of leave me bored in the Midnight Runner. No, I'm coming with you, but also I can possibly help you. Now, you do have the two characters head over to the home of Coley. The problem is that when they walk into his home, it's completely wrecked, but also there is a message on the wall. So it kind of shows something very serious is going on here when it comes to Coley. Now, back on Muir Island, we see Rory Campbell and also Brian having a conversation. Now, really, I want to focus more on Rory here. And here's the reason why. Because for Rory, he's very worried of the possibility of becoming a character known as Ahab. Now, Ahab was a character from an alternate timeline, better known as Days of Future Past. Now, in that timeline, Ahab would capture mutants and use those mutants as hounds, as a way to hunt down other mutants while working for the Sentinels. Now, for Ahab, again, that was an alternate timeline. But for Rory, he saw a possibility in his future where he does become Ahab. And so ever since he saw that, he has been trying his best to make sure there is no way he'll turn into Ahab. Now, with all that being said, we do learn that Brian was able to build a room to allow Rory to interrogate different people. Now, technically, is Rory believing that he could be like Charles Xavier, where you have Charles trying his best to fix the mind of Sabretooth? Is Rory saying, I can fix the mind of a character known as Spore? Now for Spore, he had the ability to play with people's emotions, to make them more aggressive, to kind of make them become killers or possibly attack each other or him. Just an evil person. And so right now for Rory, he's kind of hoping in the possibility he could fix the mind of Spore. Now, for Kitty Pryde and Pete Wisdom, they go over to a bar to kind of gather more information about Coley. Now, you're probably wondering, like, okay, why would you go to this bar? Well, this bar is only a bar for spies to go to. So all the different spies out there in Great Britain, they head over to this bar to talk to one another. But it's also kind of Pete hoping to get some kind of information about Coley, where you do have somebody walk up to both Pete and Kitty to inform him like, hey, listen, Coley is dead. But before we're able to learn more about that, we have to transition over to Moira McTaggart, Nightcrawler, Megan, and also Douglock. Now, really, it's them kind of looking at the DNA structure of Moira McTaggart to get the better idea of how in the world did she get the legacy virus. Because originally, the virus was only going after mutants. And the reason why, because it had the ability to attach itself to the X gene that only mutants have. But when it comes to Moira McTaggart, she does not have the X gene. So why in the world does she have the legacy virus? But on top of that, why only her? Out of all the humans across the world, why only her? Now, here's my thing, guys, because I believe that this was Marvel back then, even playing around with the idea of turning Moira McTaggart into a mutant. But unfortunately, it did not happen. Now, getting back over to Kitty Pryde and Pete Wisdom, they see the dead body of Coley. Now, here's the thing, because for Coley, he was stationed at a base called Dream Nails, and apparently he was the man in charge of security. Now, you do have the guy tell Pete and Kitty, like, hey, your friend here died by some kind of disease, but Black Air is trying their best to make sure it all stays hush-hush on what kind of disease that had just killed off Coley. Now, once you do have Pete and Kitty Pryde leave the building after seeing the dead body of his friend, they then get attacked by different people who work for Black Air. And so it kind of shows that Black Air is right now trying their best to keep everything hush-hush. Like, hey, listen, y'all could not get out with the info that you had just discovered. But with Kitty Pryde and Pete Wisdom both being mutants and knowing how to fight, they were able to take those guys out that were sent there by Black Air. But it now tells Pete he needs to continue his whole investigation to figure out what exactly is going on right now with Black Air. But as we get into issue number 89, we pick back up with Kitty Pryde and also Pete Wisdom once again, and you have the two characters now staying at the bar that's made for spies to go to because they're well protected inside that bar. Now, for Pete and also Kitty Pryde, while they're having a conversation with one another, you didn't have this guy walk up, and his name is Jardine. And yes, I did look on the internet to make sure that name is correct because for a while there I thought it was Jardine. But for Jardine, he saw, hey, listen, I have some info about what exactly happened to Coley. So come back to my office with me and I'll explain everything that I had just discovered. But getting back over to Muir Island, we see Nightcrawler being confronted by his girlfriend Amanda Sefton. Now, Amanda is technically part of Excalibur. Amanda is technically also Nightcrawler's adoptive sister. But anyways, though, you do have her stop by and you do have the two characters kiss. Now, you have Nightcrawler inform Amanda about what Rory is currently up to with his whole interrogation room. Now, Amanda also knows about the dark secret of Rory, the whole idea that they saw a glimpse into his future, the possibility of him becoming a Hab. And so this is her now kind of wondering, is this the beginning of him going down that dark path where he does turn into that dark character? And so as we transition over to Rory, we see him beginning his interrogation on Spore. And I find it really funny. And the reason why, because, okay, for Rory, his main goal is to get into the mind of Spore. And he kind of realize what kind of person Spore is, because Spore has to be in control of every single type of situation. But what happens when somebody else is in control? And so you have Rory at first kind of list out all the different things that Spore has done to other people to kind of show that Spore has to be in control. But what happens when he begins to list out all the bad things done to Spore? And so you have Rory say, you know what, Spore, let's go ahead and dive into your past. Yeah, let's do that. And so you have Rory bring up the fact that his father had killed off his mother. Now for Spore, all this time he believed that his mother had just ran away because his dad told him that. But in reality, no, his dad killed his mother. And so it's getting into the mind of Spore in the most messed up type of way. Now, for Kitty, Pete, and also Jardine, they do regroup at Jardine's office. And when they do, they kind of go over all the different pieces of information they had gathered so far. Now, one of the things they have learned so far is a line said by Coley, and it said "Easy Tiger." Now, it's a code word technically used as a way to say that, hey, we had some alien stuff going on over here. So Dream Nails, the facility that Coley was working at, was most likely keeping some alien stuff locked away. Now, as we saw in the opening page of the storyline, that is true. And so now for our heroes, their main goal is to get inside that facility to learn more about what Dream Nails is all about, but also what Black Air has locked away inside that facility. But while you have Pete walk out of the room, you have Kitty ask a tad bit more about, Pete wisdom from Jardine. And you have Jardine tell Kitty Pryde everything he knows about Pete. And it kind of shows that Pete is a great guy, where of course you have Kitty Pryde begin to wonder more about Pete in a way of possibly getting with him. Now, for a brief moment, we have to transition back over to Muir and McTaggart as we continue the whole idea of the legacy virus. And when it comes to Megan and also Douglock, they had used their own abilities as a way to kind of look into more of a reason why the legacy virus would affect Muir and McTaggart. And really, by the end of this section, we learn that there is no actual reason. Like, basically, the virus is attached to her for some unknown reason. And so it's them saying like, well, it does seem like the virus just went to you for no good reason. It's just spreading across the world. And so we have to move on and get back over to Pete and also Kitty Pryde. Now, while you have Pete and Kitty Pryde heading over to Dream Nails' facility, you have Pete and Kitty kind of get into another argument. Now, this argument is really more about the idea that Pete wants to go inside the facility on his own, and Kitty says no. But it's also Kitty kind of expressing that she knows the true side of Pete, that he's not just some guy who does not care about anything at all, that Pete does truly care about, other people. And so it kind of shows the two characters are now beginning to understand one another, but also the possibility of them getting together as well. And so the next few pages are really more of us seeing Kitty Pryde, but also Pete Wisdom working together and using their abilities, but also skills they have picked up over the years to kind of help them break into the Dream Nails facility. Now, while they're breaking into the facility, they do find this computer where it should have all the information that they are technically looking for. And so with that computer, we do learn that, okay, for Coley, he did work here at Dream Nails' facility, but he was kind of being kept as a security guard to watch over a certain group of aliens. Now, these aliens, they carried a special kind of bacteria that does affect humans. Now, for Coley, he did have some gear on to protect him, but the problem was you had one of those aliens bite through that gear. And so, of course, when he got bitten by that alien, he was also infected by that bacteria. So that is how he died, by some kind of disease. And when it came to Coley, he knew that he could not go over to Black Air, because if he did, Black Air will just turn him into some kind of lab rat. And so his main goal was kind of get the word out there about what Black Air is doing at this facility. But this chapter truly does end with a bunch of guards just rushing into the room. And when they do, they kind of put Kitty and also Pete in a position where Kitty's not really able to get to Pete in time to save his life. But if she does move, they're going to kill him. But if he moves, they're going to kill her. And so she has no choice but to go ahead and just leave him behind. And you then have Pete get knocked out, which of course leads us into the final chapter of this storyline. And so now we have to dive into the final chapter, issue number 90. And issue number 90 was a double-sized issue, so of course it does have some extra pages as well. Now, with Pete Wisdom now technically being a prisoner of Black Air, they had assigned a special person to kind of deal with him. And that would be a character known as Shrine. Now, for Shrine, he is a telepath, so it allows him to go into the mind of Pete Wisdom, but to also kind of make him relive a lot of different moments of his life, and most likely the worst moments. Now, here is the thing, because you also had Black Air and also Shrine supposedly give Pete Wisdom a special kind of virus. and it's called the Black Eagle. Now, the Black Eagle came from that bacteria from the alien race that Black Air had captured. We also learn the name of this alien race, and they're known as the Uncreated. Now, the Uncreated will appear a few more times in our coverage over the X-Men, but also in our coverage over the cosmic side of Marvel Comics as well. But with that being said, as the Black Air begins to eat away at the body of Pete Wisdom, it's also trying, kind of hoping to go into the mind of Pete Wisdom, to cause him pain, to basically relive the worst moments of his life. And apparently, they also gave Pete some kind of device to cancel out his powers as well. Now, for Kitty Pryde, it's just her trying her best to stay away from all the different, security guards of Black Air. But while trying to do that, you do have her run into this room. Now, this room is full of all these different alien artifacts that Black Air has been keeping the entire time. But we're now kind of getting into the idea of the possibility of Black Air being around much longer than our heroes know of. But on top of that, Black Air might know more things than our heroes know about different kinds of alien races. And you'll see what I mean as we go through the rest of this storyline. Now, for Moira McTaggart, it's just still her kind of getting over the fact that she has the legacy virus, but you also have Wolfbane appear. Now, a long time ago, like in the early days of Chris Claremont's X-Men, you had Wolfbane technically be adopted by Moira McTaggart. So it's kind of like a mom and daughter relationship here. And so for Wolfbane, is her kind of finding out like, hey, my adoptive mother is dying. I need to go see how she is doing. And so it's Wolfbane and Moira McTaggart being able to spend some time with one another. But getting back over to Kitty Pryde, you have Kitty Pryde walk into this room where she finds all these different alien artifacts. Now, one of the artifacts is a phalanx. It's a phalanx that had affected a Skrull. And so we're getting into the idea of the Black Air organization knowing more about the phalanx than the X-Men does. Like, for example, they also have a head of a brood as well. But they also have this random spider alien that could go after people who have the X gene. And of course, talking about mutants. Now, for Kitty Pryde, she's then confronted by another group of aliens that are still alive. And these are called the Uncreated. Now, the Uncreated are the ones who had helped Black Air create that brand new virus, better known as Black Eagle. Now, as we transition back over to Pete Wisdom, you have Pete just being basically tortured by Shrine, where you have Shrine just continue to dive into the mind of Pete Wisdom, picking up different moments of horrible things Pete has saw over time in his life. Like, for example, where he had to go out of his way to collect an artifact, an alien artifact that was being kept by a cult. Now, this cult had killed themselves by poison. So when it came to Pete arriving there, all he found was all of these dead bodies just laying around the item that he was there to collect. Now, Shrine does not stop there because he also dives into the mind of the moment where Pete had lost his mother, because his mother was waiting for him to be picked up. But apparently some random guy with a gun went around and killed off a bunch of people, including his mother. So continuing the idea of just diving deeper and deeper into the mind of Pete Wisdom. But back on Muir Island, you have another conversation going on between Amanda and also Rory Campbell. Now, it's really more of Amanda kind of expressing that she's kind of worried for Rory because she kind of wonders of the possibility of him becoming Ahab. Now, for Rory, he does try his best to convince her that most likely it will not happen at all. But the thing is, he does tell her that the day he no longer cares for mutants is the day he might become Ahab. But for right now, he cares for mutants too much to turn to that kind of man. And so it's him trying his best to ease the mind of Amanda. But the whole problem is that that possibility is still out there of him becoming Ahab, being a guy who truly hunts down mutants. But now it's time for us to kind of dive into the origin of the Uncreated. Now, the Uncreated is an alien race we're going to see a few more times in our coverage over the X-Men, but the Uncreated was originally called the Works. Now, they were a peaceful group, and the thing was, they believed that they were created by a god, or really the god. But then after a while, they kind of got tired of how they were living, and they also wanted to meet this god. Now, when it came to the Works, or the Uncreated, they left their home world and found a being that they had believed to be the god. And so you had the Uncreated kill off that god just like that. The problem was that when you had these creatures go over to different planets, they kind of realized that you had different groups of people believe in different types of gods. And so for the Uncreated, we kind of got to the idea that their main goal was to kill off all the religions across the world, or the universe, sorry. And so for the Uncreated, that was their main goal. Now, this group right here was only one small group of the Uncreated who had arrived on Earth. Except when they had crashed on Earth, they were captured by black air. And so that explains why they are here. But also, the whole idea of the brand new virus, it came from them, the bacteria that they currently carry. Now, for Pete and also Shrine, you still have them going on with one another, where you have Shrine just going deeper and deeper into the mind of Pete. Now, once you do have Shrine find a certain memory, he believes once again he can use that memory as a way to attack the mind of Pete. But he is incorrect, because for Pete, this was not a bad moment at all. Now, before we can continue, we have to bring up the fact that this entire room is full of that bacteria that's full of Black Eagle, that brand new virus. So now Shrine is possibly being affected by that virus. But either way, for Shrine, he still believes that he can use his brand new memory that he had just found as a way to attack the mind of Pete. But he can't, because for Pete, it wasn't a bad moment. Pete just killed off a bunch of terrorists who were doing some bad things. And so for Pete, he's kind of like, no, I want you to watch what I did to those people. And for Shrine, he begins to freak out. But I want to transition back over to Worry, because for Worry, as he continues to interrogate Spore, we're getting into the idea that Spore is not really being affected by what Worry is trying to do. Like, yes, Worry can continue to bring up all these different bad moments. But for Spore, what he's doing right now is using his ability on Worry, or technically getting into the mind of Worry. And let me explain, because we're now seeing Worry bring out the more aggressive side of him, where he's now getting very upset with whatever Spore says. But it's also Spore kind of playing mind games with Worry about what he overheard when it came to Worry's and Amanda's conversation. And so it kind of shows the possibility of Worry now beginning to fall down the wrong path of the possibility of becoming Ahab. So now we have to jump back and forth between two different settings. So for example, we now have Worry getting more upset when it comes to Spore in his mind games. But you have Shrine also realizing that he's no longer in control of this entire situation, that now technically Pete is. And so you do have Spore get beat down by Worry, and you do have Pete being able to affect the mind of Shrine to defeat him and break out of his interrogation room. And so this kind of leads into the rest of the book, where technically you have Pete being able to escape. He finds Kitty. You have the two characters being able to catch up with one another. But after doing that, they decide to go ahead and download all the information they can from this base, but also blow the place up and get away. And the book does kind of end on the note where technically we see the two of them on the Midnight Runner making out with one another. So we're now establishing the whole idea of their relationship. But this is where we're going to end today's comic book video. So please leave me a like down below and subscribe. But guys, see y'all next time. Later.